Good day to you. I'm not sure how typical my Facebook page is compared to other people's, but if you take a look at it, you may not be able to read it because of backwards writing, but the very first post there is by a colleague at ESU, and she's asking people who can't make it to the Eastern Psychological Association meeting that she'll be speaking about a topic that you can still watch even if you're not going to the meeting. This is way out of my field. I don't really have an interest in that discipline wise. It's on my Facebook. Scrolling down, here's a colleague who's talking about a restaurant that she went to, putting it on Facebook, posting pictures of the restaurant. Now here's a random sponsored post. It's got Ozzy Osbourne and Randy Rhoads. Ozzy Osbourne, ex-singer and ex-singer and songwriter for Black Sabbath, and that's his guitarist who died. I guess they know that I like rock and roll. Here's a perfect gift for dog parents. Who knows that I have a dog? Somebody does. And here's, again, another colleague. He's posting a meme about science. Okay, so I don't know how typical my Facebook page is and whether it's typical at all, but it's got a lot of information on there related to what Facebook thinks are my interests, right? It's got a lot of advertising targeted at me based on my interaction with colleagues and friends. And that's how Facebook works, and that's what we're talking about in today's class. We're talking about Facebook as we take on Chapter 6. I do want to alert you to the fact that I had to make a change to the syllabus. It had an incorrect topic listed for today, and I've fixed that. So hopefully you have today's downloaded syllabus as we take on Facebook. Taking on Facebook. It started not as the movie The Social Connection portrays it, as an upstart company by four young poor people who made it rich. That's not really what happened, as Fuchs points out. Facebook was a successful company largely because of venture capital. Do you know what venture capital? Venture capital is money that goes into another growing company, money that's put in by investors to help that company grow. So Facebook benefited from that. And it was not a simple company, so to speak, that was starting up by Mark Zuckerberg and friends. Also, Fuchs wants to make the point that in the film, The Social Connection, which is how most people have come to understand the personalities behind the rise of Facebook, that the film advances the idea that everybody can be rich, and that's not really the case, statistically speaking, that really only a few people have chances of becoming rich. You can decide for yourself whether that's true, but it's an important way that he starts out the chapter because he's talking in this chapter about Facebook's political economy and what that means for our society, especially in terms of surveillance. Wait till you get into the chapter and you start to read about surveillance and what that means for your daily life. So let's take on Facebook as Fuchs does, and he makes the point right away that 99% of Facebook's revenues come from advertising. That's how they make their money, by targeted advertising. That's what Facebook is doing, 99%. It's varied over the years, but the most recent recording had it at 99%. You can look at the chart in the book. What Facebook is doing on a continuous basis is surveilling. Do you know that word? Surveilling its prosumers continuously. Facebook is monitoring everybody who is using Facebook, even when you're not around Facebook. Like I used Facebook to open class today. It's still open on my computer. Just because I'm typing on it doesn't mean that it's not collecting data right now. It's continuously surveying its prosumers, constantly monitoring and recording the personal data that people are choosing to put on Facebook through the photos, the likes, the shares, the comments, the clicks. In essence, the clicks. Yeah, that's what it comes down to. And what Facebook has done is it's pioneered bundles of user groups that it then sells to advertisers. So somebody like myself who's 59 years old, I love rock and roll. I love the Rolling Stones. I belong to a couple of Rolling Stones fan groups. There's a few of them out there. Facebook has got that information. We are all bundled together. We are people similar age range, people with a similar income, people with similar rock and roll tastes, people with similar areas that we like to travel to, similar things we like to eat, drink, etc. We are being sold continuously just by participating in those kinds of groups, and you are too, whatever groups that you're participating in, if you're on this old school platform, as it is known, Facebook. Let's not forget that users are a commodity. As Dallas Smythe said, remember Dallas Smythe is brought back up in this chapter, users are a commodity, but on Facebook, the users are exposed to a double jeopardy. As Fuchs point out, there's a double commodity logic. Because on the one hand, the products of subjectivity are commodities. And what that means is each and every person is putting something on Facebook that is totally personal to you. It's just yourself. You're meaning it to be an expression of you and nobody else. That's the subjectivity part. We are all subjective when we are trapped inside of ourselves. And so the products of our subjectivity, though, are commodities. That's the big data that people are using, all this subjectivity that we're putting on Facebook all the time. So that's one jeopardy to us, that the fact that we're putting ourselves and what we think and like and where we go and what we eat on Facebook as big data, that's one jeopardy. But the double jeopardy is that our consciousness, what we are aware of, becomes permanently exposed to that commodity logic. That I can see that graphic that came up with Ozzy Osbourne and Randy Rhoads, it has appealed to me because I remember those guys, I remember those hairstyles, I remember listening to that album in my dorm at Millersville University. I'm going to click on it, see what that's about. Now all of a sudden, I'm reading more about Ozzy Osbourne, but not until I go past some ads, not before maybe I had to subscribe to something. And now I'm being exposed to the logic of getting information about an artist by having to go through Facebook's protocol for targeting me for advertising. It's a double jeopardy that's going on. One of the most famous philosophers is a French philosopher named Michel Foucault, Foucault. He has a book called Discipline and Punishment. And he says that surveillance of information is done to control people. That's what it's done for. It's to control people. And when you combine Foucault with Marx, therefore, you get to the conclusion that surveillance is the use of information for power. And that's how you control people. It's constantly monitoring what people's likes are, what they're talking about, who they're speaking with, who their networks are, where they're spending their time. And it's taking that then and using that information to exercise power over their purchasing habits, power over their ability to talk with others. Now, a lot of this will take a while to develop. That's what this class is about. Again, it's not designed to make you be afraid of the world or think that around the corner there is an evil capitalist waiting to pick your pocket. No. I have to say, I'm as much of a capitalist as the next American. What we are doing in this class is deconstructing capitalism because we never look at it in our country. We don't look at it. We just assume it's good. Just assume it's good. So we're breaking it down in this class. And we're talking about how surveillance is going to be used for power. And when you think about surveillance, it's not even like security camera surveillance, like when you go to Wawa or an ATM machine. No, it's actually mass self-surveillance. Mass self-surveillance, yeah. That's what Facebook is doing because everybody who's using Facebook is providing surveillance of themselves. They're providing their locations. They're providing the weddings that they're going to. They're providing how much they spent for a beer. They're providing everything. And so it's self-surveillance, and it's taking place on a mass scale. Now, let's also mention that Facebook has as a big strategy the acquisition of other companies. Facebook purchases companies that are either going to be competitors, like Instagram, or what was the other one that's got there for Instagram, or Oculus, or it develops new extensions of its company by purchasing other companies like WhatsApp, getting into the voice over messaging world side of social media. That's what WhatsApp allowed Facebook to do. Now let's talk about the political economy of WhatsApp, another very big application. It's the second most used app. If you look at Fuchs data, it's the second most used social media app. It's WhatsApp. It's a messaging and voice over IP service. It serves a more narrow profile data-wise when it comes to Facebook in terms of what it saves. You can read about that in terms of its privacy statement. It's all laid out by Fuchs. It's more narrow. Facebook collects a lot more. What WhatsApp basically collects information on is your profile data for the most part. But WhatsApp then shares its data with Facebook because Facebook owns it, and also with Instagram. Therefore, if you are on WhatsApp, you're not necessarily protected because you're going to be targeted by Facebook and by Instagram, even though WhatsApp says we don't want to introduce advertising. You can read what the founders said. They were against introducing advertising. You don't see advertising on WhatsApp, but it's all shared. It's all shared. Your big data is being shared. So the WhatsApp business model is another model of capital accumulation, where you think that you're not being surveyed for profit, but you really are. Now let's move to Facebook and what Fuchs calls the like ideology, the like ideology. This is really an interesting way to look at Facebook, I think, and it's the idea that it is biased towards liking things. There is no unlike button on Facebook, right? You've probably maybe even made that comment if you're a Facebook user. Where's the unlike button? Your choice is to like, and then if you want to use one of the emoji icons, you have 4 smiley faces and 2 sad faces. That also biases your choices towards liking what is going on. So Facebook has a bias towards a liking culture, which advertisers in turn like, because they don't want to be putting media content onto a social media platform where people are expressing discontent. So the liking ideology is part of the capital accumulation model in just another way. And to illustrate the point, Fuchs says, if you look at the Holocaust, you would not try to express seeing a photograph of the anniversary of the Holocaust by liking it, would you? No, but that's your choice in Facebook. If you see for Breast Cancer Awareness Week that so many women, X amount of women have died from breast cancer, you wouldn't want to like that, would you? But that's Facebook's choices. It's a liking culture. All right, now let's move on to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, also touching in the area of fake news now, which you may have thought of as previously existing mostly in broadcasting, but it exists in social media for sure. And I don't want to go too far into the criticisms of the Donald Trump campaign that Fuchs goes into here. That's for you. My interest in this class is not to take a political side for a political party standpoint, but to study the phenomena from the vantage point of a critical media analyst. And so it is of interest to me that starting with Fuchs' statement that in 2008 there was a global crisis. Most of you were very young and may not have a big impression about what happened in 2008, but I can tell you as a homeowner, my property values fell, unemployment went way up. We were in a recession/depression that took us a good 6 to 8 years to recover. It was a very hard time in this country, and Fuchs says one of the outcomes of that time period because of social media afterwards was that societies afterwards became very polarized, meaning that one side of the public thinks this way and the exact number of people just about think the opposite way about immigration or about the economy or taxes or political parties or the coronavirus, you name it, or Ukraine. It's the idea that we have these huge opposites. We don't have many people in the middle mixing with each other. And so because of that polarization, some scholars have written about how our conversations have been affected, and we are being placed in what some scholars call filter bubbles. The scholar Eli Pariser, Pariser, wrote a book called The Filter Bubble, and he argues that algorithmic culture, isn't that an interesting way to think of yourself? Algorithmic culture advances homogeneity because algorithms are used by social media to target us with things that we like. Therefore, we only participate in things that we like with other people who are liking the same things, and so we're not being exposed to alternate ideas or alternate products or alternate anything. We're caught up in a filter bubble. That's what Eli Pariser says is going on because of social media. And the Cambridge Analytica scandal kind of extends that. So Cambridge Analytica was a research firm. It was used by the Donald Trump organization. It was in some of the early days of Facebook targeted advertising, political advertising. Fuchs is very critical of Facebook accepting political advertising. He points out that Twitter does not accept targeted political advertising because what he says goes on is people who are in these filter bubbles that I talk about are susceptible to fake news. They can be targeted through bots and other techniques on the web with news that appears to be it's real and it's not. So you could put out anything that says that Joe Biden had a heart attack, and for example, and nobody knows about it. Okay, all of a sudden you can get that going around on the web, and you can get people to believe that, especially people who are already inclined to want to believe that Joe Biden is part of a larger conspiracy. And so what we're talking about here is not new to you, right? You know that this goes on, but the Cambridge Analytica scandal was much bigger because Fuchs talks about how in this particular case that research firm was used to target people who were susceptible to believing untruths about the election and eventually voted for Donald Trump. That's what this scandal is about. And he points out that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, also was involved in this scandal. It actually fined Facebook $5 billion, $5 billion for violating users' privacy. That means people who are using Facebook and signing on to the privacy statement, but not agreeing that their data would be used by a political firm to target them with advertising. Now, Fuchs says probably if people had known about, if they had been offered that as part of the privacy statement, they probably would have done it anyhow to be part of Analytica, but the fact that it didn't take place. And he uses that to point out that surveillance is invisible. It's invisible and it's intransparent. We may think that we're signing things that we give us awareness of what we're doing with our private data. But do you really know when you sign all those medical forms what you're agreeing to? Isn't it just sign here, sign here, sign here because of a fatigue of signing things, right? It's on us, but this is part of the surveillance society that Fuchs is trying to show. And he calls it authoritarian capitalism. It's authoritarian capitalism, no less, because it's in a way forcing you to take part in something that you're not necessarily aware that you're taking part in. And what you're taking part in is part of capital accumulation on a constant basis based on surveillance of your habits. One of the other terms used in this chapter to critique what's happening with a surveillance society is post-truth. Post-truth is a circumstance where objective facts are no longer as important as appeals to emotion. Appeals to emotion, you have people, for example, looking at the vaccination situation in the United States. You have people who say, I'm not going to get vaccinated because I just feel it's going to affect my genetics. Well, what about all the scientific data that says we have all these studies that show that no genetics have been affected? It doesn't really matter to me. I just have this feeling about that. I know that something's going to... That's what post-truth is about. Now, I'm not arguing for or against the vaccination. That's a personal choice, but I'm arguing that as an example of how post-truth exists, particularly in a social media world. Now let's go to false news, also known as fake news, as we call it. So false news, fake news is information that's disseminated under the guise of being news. So it seems to have all the conventions of being news, but it's not really news. And the point that Fuchs is making here that I believe should be underscored the most is that all private media, including all of the social media platforms, all private media show biases. They all show biases. They have to, because they are trying to get you to engage in prosuming behavior. I finally had enough with this blind. Let me see if I can. All right, that's a little bit. That's a little better, I should say. All private social media platforms, which are all the platforms that you belong to in this class, certainly for your projects, they are naturally biased. They have to be, because they are trying to turn each and every person that uses them into a prosumer with targeted advertising based on their already held beliefs. And so what's going on is hardly any degree of equality. We're going to develop that as we go on. We're going to start by doing that with our next concept, and it's going to take the whole course really to show that to you. But the next concept is that truth can only exist in a classless society. Now, I know many of you may recoil at that classless society. It sounds like communism. It sounds like socialism. Yeah, classless society is a big part of those, but the This is an academic class. We are not promoting communism. We are not promoting socialism. We're not promoting capitalism. We're really not promoting any ism. We're promoting understanding of the isms. And so within that context, I hope you consider that in a classless society, what you don't have happening is the following. This happens in a class society where you have rich people, poor people, middle class people, people below the poverty line, ultra rich people. That's a class society. What happens is you substitute workers for algorithms to fact check. Yeah, that's what social media platforms do. Facebook, they use algorithms to fact check. What could be more important than fact checking political claims? They use algorithms rather than workers. That's not about truth. Workers are much more qualified to examine truth if they have the same set of criteria that they're working from than an algorithm. It's just not possible. Also, in a class society as opposed to a classless society, you do not have political advertising outlawed. Whereas in a classless society, you would have that outlawed because political advertising is by its very nature manipulative, and it is under the radar as part of the invisible surveillance that takes place. And finally, in a class society versus a classless, you have only private profit-making news platforms which reinforce class divisions and tell you what kinds of products you should purchase because of the class that you're in, or the race that you're in, or the ethnicity that you're in, or the religion that you're in, instead of having non-profit social media platforms, new platforms that you probably can't envision right now because you've only been exposed to profit-making platforms in a capitalist accumulation model that's in the country that's leading the world. Maybe Japan is a close second, or maybe also with the U.S., with a capitalist model as the predominant model for the way a society operates. You'll see in this chapter that Mark Zuckerberg is critiqued pretty strongly by Fuchs. He presents his testimony in Congress before AOC. She's an elected politician right now, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. And it just shows that Fuchs is trying to make Zuckerberg look like a very cagey person who's pretending he doesn't know how data is used in his company. That's for you to decide, but you will see that Facebook has a lot of fines that have been levied against it over the years for violations of privacy. We've mentioned only one today. We're going to mention some others in the course. So all of this leads us to the conclusion, does it not, even though it may have snuck up on us, that Facebook and other social media platforms are actually anti-social social media. They're anti-social social media. If we return to Marx, he says that domination and class structures create a gap in us. They create a gap in us between the existence that we have in society and our social essence. There's a gap that's created because of the domination of these capital accumulation firms that are making all this money off of us. Facebook is making $80 billion off of people. That because of the domination of that huge company surveying us all the time, collecting every piece of data that we put on there, selling it to other platforms, and the structures that result, getting us into certain bundles of prosumers, that because of that, we get confused about our existence, going through life, daily existence, and what our essence is. What are we really about? Are we really about something that cannot be achieved unless we purchase something? Isn't that what retail therapy is? What are you about when you break up with somebody or somebody breaks up with you and you're really sad? What do you do? I'm going on Amazon and I'm buying something. That's retail therapy. There you go. That's confusion about what your essence is. Is your essence of solving that uncomfortable emotional situation? Is it about purchasing something to make yourself better, purchasing a commodity? So as a result, Marx says when you have this conflict going on because of class conflicts, you get alienation. Alienation is the result of capitalism's unsocial character. You get alienation. You feel like The people across the street are people that you don't have a connection with because they are into different purchasing behaviors. They are country music fans. They've got completely different beer, completely different automobiles than rock and roll fans. And oh, those people down there, those people are sports fans. And they buy clothes that are completely different from clothes. See what happens? That's what we're trying to point out here through capital accumulation models. The structure of the capital accumulation model affects our social relations at every single level. And so what we're talking about, Fuchs is trying to do, is to build a case for socializing antisocial social media. For socializing media that should be social in the first place. Remember, we asked the question, are social media social? We're trying to prove that they're not. And so Fuchs is arguing, and this will take the book to lay out, that public broadcasters should build their own social media platforms and should be encouraged to do that and be provided with resources and funding so that those can expand so that they are truly public spheres where there are no commercial interests. And he says that this could be paid for by taxing advertising, online advertising, to pay for public media. Now you may say, oh, government taxation, and you're fine if you can think that. But I just want to let you know that is done in other countries. That is done, for example, in England. If you purchase a television set, your name goes into a national database, and then you have to pay what's known as a license fee for the right to access public television on that television set. The license fee is about $400 a year. And what that means is that license fee is collected, and then it's provided, that the money that's collected by that is provided to the public broadcaster, which is the BBC World Service, the BBC. The BBC can then go produce programming, TV programming, that is not restricted by what advertisers will fund. And advertisers have so much influence over the content once they get involved. They want their products to be associated with the right kinds of symbols. That's another discussion, but allowing social media platforms to spring up from public media broadcasting and to spring up with funding from taxation is a way that we can get these going. And Fuchs is saying, and here's the payout for you, people who go on to this site will receive a participatory media fee. Yeah, for all the money that's made on this site, there will be one giant check that's cut and then divvied up amongst all the users who are providing the big data that is being used as big data that's commodified for commercial making enterprises. This brings us to our final concept for the class, which is to talk about our capitalism really as surveillance capitalism. That's what it's all about. Shoshana Zuboff, the professor of business at Harvard University and the Harvard Business School, says that surveillance capitalists, they really know everything about us today. They know everything about us because every time you go anywhere, your phone in your back pocket is saying where your location is. And then you are voluntarily telling people all day long what you're doing through your texting, through your phone calls, through asking Alexa questions or Google questions, and certainly through purchases that you make online, as well as all those shares, posts, likes, and everything you do with every single keystroke. You are self-surveilling yourself for the benefit of capital accumulation companies. And Shoshana Zuboff says that the people who are designing the algorithms are trying to predict our futures for us, what we should buy to move ourselves and how we should behave, not for our own sakes, but for others' sakes, for corporate media's sake, for corporate companies' sakes, not for our own sakes. And there's a very big difference of that. And actually, Zuboff says that every aspect of human existence today has become labor because of social media. Is that not a provocative thought? If you think of yourself as laboring every time you're on social media, really, every aspect of your existence today is spent laboring on social media, and that's causing a conflict, is it not, for your human essence? What are you really about? Heavy to think about, right? Well, that's what we're supposed to be doing in this class. Have a great day. To be continued.